A small girl, no older than 7, ran barefoot through the cold, dimly lit streets, her tiny chest heaving with desperate breaths, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks as fear pushed her forward faster than her legs could handle, until she stumbled into a place no child should ever go, a dark, smoky warehouse known across the city as the territory of a feared mafia boss, a man whispered about in terror, a man whose name made even grown men lower their voices, and as the heavy doors creaked open and the guards reached for their weapons, the trembling girl cried out in a broken voice, "Please! They're beating my mama," and in that moment, something unexpected happened, the entire room fell silent, the guards froze, and at the center of it all, seated in a leather chair like a king in a kingdom of shadows, the mafia boss slowly lifted his head, his cold, unreadable eyes locking onto the child, and for a second, it looked like he would simply dismiss her, like every other problem in the city that didn't concern him. But then she took a step closer, clutching his coat with her tiny, shaking hands, and whispered again, weaker this time, "Please, she's going to die," and something shifted inside him, something buried so deep that even he had forgotten it existed, a memory, perhaps, of a life he once had, or a person he once cared about, and without a word, he stood up, his men exchanging confused glances because this was not the kind of thing their boss responded to, yet his voice came out sharp and commanding, "Get the car," and within seconds, the entire operation moved like a storm unleashed, black SUVs roaring through the streets as the girl sat beside him, still crying but now holding on to a strange, fragile hope, and when they arrived at the broken-down building she pointed to, the sounds of shouting and violence echoed through the walls, but before anyone could react, the mafia boss kicked the door open with terrifying force, his presence alone enough to make the attackers freeze mid-action, their confidence evaporating as they recognized who stood before them. And what followed was swift and merciless. His men handled everything with brutal efficiency while he walked past them, his focus only on the woman lying on the floor, bruised and barely conscious, and the little girl rushed to her side, sobbing, "Mama, I brought help," and the boss stood there for a moment, looking down at them, his hardened expression cracking just slightly as he turned to his men and said, "Call a doctor now," and no one dared question him, because in that moment, the most feared man in the city wasn't acting like a criminal, he was acting like something far more dangerous, a man with a reason, and as the sirens of his private medics replaced the sounds of violence, and the attackers were dragged away to face consequences far worse than prison, the girl looked up at him with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time in years, the mafia boss didn't respond with silence or indifference, but with a quiet nod, as if that simple gratitude carried more weight than all the power he had built, and as he walked away into the night, his empire still intact but something inside him forever changed, the city would never know that on that night, a little girl's cry had done what no rival, no enemy, and no amount of bloodshed ever could, it had reached the heart of a man who was supposed to have none. The night didn't end when the sirens faded and the bruised woman was carried into the waiting vehicle. In many ways, it had only just begun, because as the black SUVs cut through the sleeping city, their engines humming like distant thunder, the little girl sat curled beside her unconscious mother, gripping her hand tightly as if letting go would mean losing her forever, while across from them the mafia boss remained silent, his sharp eyes fixed not on the road but on the reflection in the tinted glass, as though he were staring into a past he had long buried. And for the first time in years, his mind was not occupied with power, territory, or revenge, but with a simple, haunting question: why had this child's voice reached him when nothing else ever had? Why had her tears pierced through layers of steel he had built around his heart? And why did he feel a strange, unfamiliar responsibility settling over him like a weight he could neither understand nor ignore? The convoy arrived at a private medical facility hidden far from the public eye, a place owned and controlled by him, where no questions were asked and no records were kept, and as the doors burst open and doctors rushed forward, the woman was immediately taken inside, leaving the little girl standing alone in the hallway, her small frame trembling under the harsh white lights, until the mafia boss stepped out of the shadows behind her and, in an uncharacteristically gentle tone, said, "She's going to be treated. No one will hurt her again." But the girl didn't respond with relief. She turned, her wide eyes searching his face, and asked the one thing he hadn't prepared for, "Will you stay?" And for a moment, the most feared man in the city hesitated, his instinct telling him to walk away, to return to his world where emotions were weaknesses and attachments were liabilities, but something in her voice, something so raw and desperate, anchored him there, and without fully understanding why, he gave a short nod and said, "I'll stay," and so he did, standing in that sterile hallway for hours as doctors worked behind closed doors, his men watching from a distance, whispering among themselves because they had never seen their boss like this, still, silent, almost human. As the night stretched into morning, the doctor finally emerged, exhaustion etched into his face, and delivered the verdict: the woman would live, but the injuries were severe, the kind that didn't come from a single moment of anger but from prolonged suffering, repeated cruelty, and neglect. And as the Mafia boss listened, a quiet rage began to burn within him, colder and more dangerous than any fury he had ever felt before, because this wasn't about territory or betrayal. This was something else entirely, something personal, and when he asked, "Who did this?" the little girl, who had been sitting silently in the corner, spoke up with a trembling voice and told him everything, about the man who came into their lives pretending to help, about the nights filled with shouting and fear, about how her mother had tried to protect her until she couldn't anymore, and as she spoke, her words painted a picture that ignited something dark and unstoppable inside him, a storm that no one in that room dared to interrupt, and when she finished, he simply turned to one of his men and said, "Find him," just 2 words, calm and controlled. But everyone in that room knew what they truly meant. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet intensity. As information was gathered, locations were tracked, and within a day, the man responsible was found hiding in a rundown apartment, unaware that his fate had already been sealed. And when the Mafia boss arrived, he didn't storm in with violence or noise. Instead, he walked in slowly, deliberately, his presence alone enough to drain the color from the man's face. And what followed was not chaos but something far more terrifying: silence, a heavy, suffocating silence as the boss stood before him and asked a single question, "Why?" And the man, shaking, tried to explain, to justify, to lie, but none of it mattered, because the answer had already been written in the bruises, in the fear, in the tears of a little girl who had nowhere else to run. And in that moment, the Mafia boss made a decision that would echo far beyond that room, not out of impulse, not out of blind rage, but out of something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to justice. When he walked out, he didn't look back, leaving his men to handle the rest, and as the door closed behind him, it marked the end of one life and the beginning of something entirely different for another. Days passed, and the woman slowly began to recover, her strength returning piece by piece, while the little girl rarely left her side, except for the moments she wandered the quiet halls and found the Mafia boss standing alone, as if he were guarding not just the building but something far more fragile within himself. And each time their eyes met, there was no fear in hers anymore, only a quiet trust that he didn't know how to accept. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she walked up to him and asked, "Are you a bad man?" And the question, simple yet piercing, caught him off guard in a way no weapon ever could, and for a long moment, he said nothing, because the truth was complicated, tangled in years of choices and consequences he couldn't undo. But finally, he answered in a low voice, "I've done bad things," and she nodded, as if she understood more than a child should, and then said something that stayed with him long after she walked away, "But you saved my mama, so you can't be all bad." And those words lingered in the air, reshaping something inside him that had been hardened for too long. And as the days turned into weeks, he found himself making decisions he never would have before, ensuring their safety, arranging a new home far from the shadows of their past, even visiting more often than he admitted, each time telling himself it was just a check on their condition, but deep down knowing it was something else, something he had lost and was slowly, cautiously finding again. However, the world he belonged to was not one that allowed change without consequence, and whispers began to spread among his rivals, rumors that the feared boss was growing soft, distracted, vulnerable, and in that world, vulnerability was an invitation for attack. And as tensions rose and enemies began to move, the fragile peace he had found was threatened, forcing him to confront a reality he could no longer ignore. that protecting them meant risking everything he had built, and the question that once seemed simple now stood before him like an unyielding wall. Could a man like him truly change, or would his past always drag him back into darkness? And as he stood once again in the shadows, watching over the small family he had saved, he realized that for the first time in his life, the answer mattered more than power, more than fear, more than anything he had ever known, because this wasn't just about who he had been, it was about who he was willing to become.